Good evening, and welcome once again to Education Matters with Jim O'Connell. It's a nice evening here in Manchester, ending up the first week of August. So it's one of those times in the city when we're between things, I guess. There are lots of things going on the, I guess, non-educational front. I do know, though, I visited some schools today just to chat to some friends and sort of see what's going on, because it's that time of the year when I don't think the secretaries come back until I believe they're back Monday. But I went by just to see what's going on, and stuff is being done, and principals and etc. are working away, getting ready. They're scheduling, and I talked to some, and one of the things that came to light was not came to light, but I was reminded of is that so we're as a city we're hiring teachers at this point, to replace people who've retired, etc. And so we're still at that process, and we're probably a few months late for it. So it's not as though there aren't any good candidates around by August, but as you can imagine yourself, if you're whatever profession you're in, if you don't have a job starting September 1st, then it's a little bit late to be leaving until now. So we've had this. I don't want to spend time in it today because it's more of a matter of mechanics and how we do things. But we really should, we've tried over the last number of years to move the budget process, etc., back to earlier in the year, so that we are able to get into a mode where we're hiring in sort of the June time frame, where all the school districts may be changing or people are finishing work, and it just lends itself to being able to hire the best people. But on the plus note, I have to say, you'll often. I might be accused sometimes of emphasising the places in Manchester school system where we are lacking, and those, of course, there are those. But one of the things that just hit me again today, and I was reminded of the additions that we're going to have this year, especially and most importantly at middle school. So we're going to see, and the picture isn't plain yet. We'll find out next week. The first school board meeting in a month or more will be held next week, I believe on Monday night. We've had some important. We've had losses. Sadly, as I talked about last week, there will be a net loss of about 14 teachers in the school district, which I dealt with that last week. So we can talk about it later. But the good news is that we are getting back some progress for the first time in many years. Whether that's because it's an election year or not, I don't know. I think to give credit to Dr. Vargas, he managed that process pretty well, and I think that both the school board and the board of mayor and aldermen had confidence in him that he would do what he promised to do, and so I think that's important. At the middle school level, we're going to see a number of things added, which will be important. So we have health for the first time, We're going to have health teachers in each of the 4 middle schools, so that's one in each of the 4 middle schools. We're also going to have foreign languages, or to be more precise, that should be singular, a foreign language. So we will have Spanish taught in each of the 4 middle schools, and that's a very important thing, because most people have agreed over the last 6 years or so, since languages were removed from our maybe 7 years ago, 6 years ago, since foreign languages were removed from our middle schools, most people would agree that that's educationally unsound, and that a generation of kids in Manchester were, to put it politely, underserved. By not having a foreign language in middle school, because it isn't just the idea of, they didn't have foreign language in and of itself. It's that that becomes the basis for doing a foreign language through high school, and then most universities today require a foreign language component, and certainly for lots of courses, there are foreign language requirements, and so kids coming out of Manchester were at a disadvantage in that regard. So I think it's a wonderful thing, and it ought to be noted here as much as, and maybe here more than other places, since I often talking about where our shortages are. So having middle school language, Spanish languages back is a wonderful thing, and I'm very delighted to see that, and some of the energy around that, and also just fresh faces and fresh blood. I mean, it's good for, in Manchester, when you put new people in front of kids, you get more than just the package of the Spanish teacher. So I don't know who those people are. I don't know if the people themselves know yet. They probably do by now, but they're being hired or have been hired in recent weeks. But in any given teacher, if the person doing the hiring, in this case the principal, has options, that person brings more than just their Spanish teaching skills. And we see that, in many of the schools, there are some teachers who are very engaged in the students' lives and extracurriculars, and they have talents other than their core subject that they bring. And to their great credit, so many teachers are involved in extramural work, etc. And most people think about teachers as teaching their subject, and then sort of disappearing off to their homes, etc. But the truth of the matter is that many teachers work on multiple programs. There are so many different things going on in schools at any one time that teachers work upon, and we hear about the ones like the sports, for instance, where there is a stipend. And teachers get paid, like a coach gets, I think it's $1,000 or $1,500, something in that range, I believe, for the year for coaching that thing. But there are lots of other programs where, like for instance, at Hillside Middle School, there will be a new chess program. So I remember 5 years ago, there were some kids there, and I was asked to start a chess club there at that time, and I just didn't have the time to. I couldn't do it, but how wonderful a thing that is if it's if there's demand there for it. And I can tell you, in middle school kids, there's always like the many other things. The chess is one of those talents, one of those games, one of those sports that people like to play. So I'm delighted to see that is reoccurring at Hillside Middle School. But back to the hiring. So we have 4 new Spanish language teachers coming in, and importantly, bringing whatever talents they have with them. Then we're adding a health teacher at each of the 4 middle schools. So this is an important piece of. I was very critical the last few weeks, and I was talking about the opiate crisis and the state's response and the city's response to the opiate crisis, and how inadequate it was. When you look at the scale of the problem, and for anybody who's interested, I think that's a bipartisan damning from me, because I don't see any great evidence on any side of the house anywhere of people being ready to move to the next level. and I'm sorry if I don't mean people are callous and don't care. I just mean there hasn't been adequate reaction. So anyway, having a health teacher at the middle schools, hopefully, will there in those 4 middle schools, every student in Manchester goes through one of those 4 middle schools, and so during that important 3-year period, which is very formative, where kids come in sort of prepubescent and it's still children largely, and this varies largely by person, of course, and they come out of 8th grade sort of fully ready as teenagers, ready to engage in high school and the challenges of high school. But those 3 years of middle school, maybe they're the tween years, right? So giving them a good foundation in healthy living, healthy choices, looking after their bodies and looking after their minds, etc. That's an important thing, and I think we'll see some real results in that over time. So then on the sort of the plus of not losing the SROs is also important, because we were under threat of losing 2 of an SRO is a school resource officer. And so those are actually Manchester Police Department officers who, there's 1 in each of the 4 middle schools, and then they're also in the high schools. But if we had gone, as was proposed under Mayor Gatsis's budget, we were going to lose 2 of them. So we would have had a half in each of the schools. And once you get to a half an SRO in a school, you've got 900, roughly 800 to 900 kids in each middle school. So 1 police officer managing a population of 1,800, it just doesn't work anymore, and the time spent sort of driving from one school to the other, albeit that it's a short amount of space. I understand it's just across the city, but if you're working, I don't know, digging a trench in your backyard, painting your living room, it's a lot harder if you have to drop everything halfway through the morning and drive to some other property across the city and do something there, and then drive back in the afternoon to continue it. So it would have been very disruptive, and the loss of 2 of the 4 SROs in the middle schools, I don't think would have been a 50% loss of effectiveness. It probably would have been much greater than that. I think so having those there is very important. So that's a big, with a small amount of money. I think $2 million is the total that was cobbled together in usual Manchester fashion. Bits from this fund, bits from that fund, bits from rainy day funds, bits from over there, to find the money. We found the money to do these. We put some money back in to do some of these things, and that's going to be a wonderful thing. I think it's important for people to understand, if you're not paying attention every day, that the school budget as proposed was $165 million, which was proposed by Mayor Gatsis. He would say, because it was required by the tax cap, that itself is debatable, and I'd be happy literally to debate that, because we've had the school board attorney has said on the 2 times that they were asked to interpret whether the school district was required to submit a budget under the tax cap or not, and both times the school board's paid for attorney said that they were not, and then the mayor's attorney, or should I say the city's attorney, had a different interpretation of the charter and decided that they were required. And so we've lived under that ruling for the last 4 or 5 years. So Mayor Gatsis proposed 165. It's important to note that the level funding to keep all programs and teachers that we'd had in place last year, to have them back in place, was $170 million. In the end, the city took the mayor's budget of 165. Pat Long put together a budget where he found an additional $2 million, and it was cobbled together by a coalition of, and agreed to by a coalition of aldermen, and we ended up with 167. But that additional $2 million was targeted to specific things. And this is an important change this year. Dr. Vargas, the school board, and then Dr. Vargas committed to the fact that if this $2 million was found over and above the mayor's budget, that specific things would be done with it. And those specific things were the programs I just talked about, So the middle school additions, and then also to hire some teachers to alleviate the overcrowding in our grade schools. So the numbers I'm not sure of in the grade schools, but as I recall, it was eight, or I believe, or something. I don't hold me to. I don't remember the exact number, but we are going to see some hiring in the elementary schools, and that might also, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to see a loss. We have a net loss of 14. So we hit between people being pink slipped and programs being eliminated, and also retirees and people leaving. There will be a net loss of 14. So some people, it's not as though we'll hire all new people. Sometimes will be people who are pink slip will be brought back and put in a different slot, or people will be moved from, there will be a transfer, I think, of personnel from high school to grade school, or high school down to middle school. All of that will fall out in the details over the next couple of weeks. But it's important to see the very fact that we have some movement back towards, on the plus side, is just very thrilling to me. I have to say, those who would dance up and down and celebrate it, it's important to note, as I said a few times in the last couple of weeks, that in Manchester we have the highest number of students per teacher of any district in the state of New Hampshire. And even though now we're going to do some rejigging, which in itself is probably good, at the end of the day, the total number of students on the bottom right hand corner, that number won't change. So we'll have 14 less teachers teaching the same number of kids. Now, to be precise, we're not sure about the 14 yet, and also the same number of kids issue. You know, one of the challenges in the city of Manchester, or in any city for that matter, but certainly in a city the size of the city of Manchester, one of the challenges is that there's no set number for the number of kids in school. It's in the end, a date is chosen, and often it's the 1st of October, or perhaps the 15th of October, or September 30th, or some one of those dates is chosen as a date to take a snapshot. And what the city is able to do is say, this is the number of children that we had registered, which, now importantly, right, that's different from the number of kids in the class, because on any given day, a certain percentage of kids are away, they're sick, they're whatever. For some reason, they're not in school. But we're able to take a snapshot of the number of registered kids on a given day, and that's the number that we'll use for the population of kids. Now, it is amazing how dynamic that is. If you go into our schools, and on any given day, literally pretty much every day of the week, but certainly every second day, in depending on the school, it will vary somewhat, but there are kids being withdrawn and kids signing up for school, literally on a daily basis. And across the district, it's absolutely every day. So kids that nobody knew were going to be leaving, sometimes it's quite normal. You know, dad gets a job with some software company in Ohio, and the family move, and off they go. Sometimes it's born of economic necessity, and we know that in the inner city areas of Manchester, and where there are many rental properties. You know, rental properties by their nature, whether it's beautiful condos down by the ballpark, or beautiful condos up off of River Road, or Hackett Hill area, or Carratzis Ave, etc., down to sort of 3-family units downtown. There's a transitory nature to the people who live there, and that isn't always. That shouldn't be too derogatory sounding. What I mean is, people don't lease apartments for 7 years at a time. They usually lease them for a year. And then there are people who are very transitory and move around quite a bit. And then we've got a homeless population, and we have a non-secure housing population. I mean, the reason why we have places like the Way Home and other programs is because there is a percentage of our population that sadly doesn't have a nice, happy house to go back home to every night, and they're not secure in it. So The challenge for the city of Manchester, or for any such complex system, is that we have a very dynamic number of kids at any given time. So you can lose a few kids out of this class. You had it all sorted out. Let's say as a principal, what they're doing today, as I visited some of them, and they're sitting in their offices, and part of what they're doing is they are trying to manage their scheduling, classes and kids and all the rest of it. And they don't have a good idea yet, they have a decent idea. They don't have a real idea of how many kids are going to be in each class, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, at high school, it gets much more complicated because of class choices, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very dynamic thing, and it changes very quickly. And when we had, like we've had for the last number of years, the highest number of kids in a classroom in the state, so we had in every single grade school or elementary schools, all 17 of them, or sorry, and the numbers are defeating me tonight. Is it 14? I think maybe it's 14, right? So it's 22 schools, 4 high schools, 4 middle schools. So yeah, that leaves 14. So let's call it 14 elementary schools. In each of those 14 elementary schools, all of them bar one, we had 30 kids to a class in some of the grades. And so what happens is, somebody comes in and their kid happens to be in 5th grade, and you already have 3 classes of 30 in 5th grade. That's how you get to 31 or 32. So it's very difficult, and that's a process that principals are doing right now. And I know that in the middle schools, for instance, one of the things, because we are, it's wonderful. I talked to somebody a while ago about saving money in schools, and so there's one part of me who would say, what a great thing! It's great to save money, but. And maybe it's a smart thing to do, but this is the state that we're at in the city of Manchester with saving money. So as we sit here tonight, in our middle schools, we have 3 assistant principals, as I understand it. We have 3 assistant principals who are being hired. They're replacing assistant principals who have moved to other positions or whatever. But there are 3 assistant principals positions in our middle schools being filled this summer. Now, normally in each of our middle schools, there's a principal and 2 assistant principals. That's a ratio of about 1 per 300 kids, something like that. Normally, one of the assistant principals does all the scheduling, which is a difficult task, and it's not. It might, if it seems simple to you, believe me, it's not. It's not simple. It's not impossible. It's just a challenging task. It's something that takes a lot of time during the summer, and people who are very good at it and get experience at it can do it quicker than those who haven't done it before. But in the city of Manchester, we hired 3 new assistant principals to replace the 3 vacant positions. But in order to save money, they would have started whatever date it would be, August 1st or July 1st. The city, to save their salaries for the month, has them all starting on September 1st or August 31st, whichever it is. But basically, their first day of work is going to be the first day of September. And so now you're left with the work that's normally done by assistant superintendents during the summertime in the middle schools. The people who are left there are left to carry that slack. Now, is it a disaster? No, it's not. But it's an example for you, the citizens of Manchester, to just know the extent to which we are going to save money wherever we can. So we're going to save, and that could be a significant amount of money. It's 3 assistant principals, and it's a month's salary for each one of them. If it's 2 months, which it may be, then it's 2 months for each one of them. That's 6 months' salary, which is half-time pay for one of them, right? So if you want to commend people like Dr. Vargas and the people making those decisions, I think it's commendable that they're finding such imaginative ways to save money in the school district. But those people who are on the outside sort of looking at this and saying, there's wastefulness in the schools and it should be rooted out. I'm sure that in any system, $167 million worth or $180 million worth, depending how you look at it, there are places where where efficiencies can be brought to bear. You're never going to get to perfection. But because I was accused earlier today by somebody I know who said, you're not willing to look at the cost savings in the schools, and it's absolutely not true. I don't go around talking about it all the time because, I'm part of the 1%. The other 99% spends a lot of its time talking about, we won't spend a dime, but we'll find savings in your kids' programs. As a taxpayer, the first dime anybody can find, a place where we could save some money that's smart, right? I spent a lot of time last week talking about false fiscal conservatism. This idea that I won't spend a dime and I just refuse to spend anything and I'm cheap. That I'm going to, instead of admitting that I'm curmudgeonly, I'm going to say that, no, I'm not that. I'm actually this other much nicer sounding thing. I'm a fiscal conservative. It's like how today we don't talk about, go back to the robber barons of the last century, and we talked about, the J.P. Morgans and the Vanderbilts, and I'm not damning them or saying they're bad people. I'm just saying they were seen as sort of the rich and the wealthy and the Gilded Age, and somehow in today's world, where the disproportionate amount of wealth in the country is now by far more in the hands of a tiny few, we've decided to use a different word for them. We call them job creators, without any evidence that they actually are job creators, but we use the word because to call them filthy rich would be kind of hard to sell the kind of programs that they want to sell in Washington, D.C., taking $800 billion from Medicaid for the poorest people in the country, and give a tax base to break to billionaires. That's kind of hard to do when you're calling them billionaires. So it's much easier to call them job creators and pretend you're doing that instead. But that's straying into politics, isn't it? So back to this idea. So in the city, I'm I'm a little conflicted about it. So I just want to say that it's great that we see such energy being put into saving money on the edges, and people should be commended for that because sadly we need every dime we can find for our schools. But it should give. Maybe there's two things, right? For those like me who feel and who know that we spend less than everybody else in the state of New Hampshire and feel that we're under-resourced and underfunded, then it just concerns me that once again we're tapping further, we're making other people work harder, we're driving harder, we're using the whip more to get more out of the horse we have pulling our cart. But then others would say, well, isn't it wonderful to see the city saving every dime it can and only having these people come in the 1st of September. So I would again, I hate to say it, I challenge, because I don't mean that in a sort of a challenging way, I guess, but I just think those who look at the school system as opposed to the city more broadly, but on the school system, those who have this notion in their head that somehow the city school system is wasteful, I'd love to see the evidence of it. Because I'd be their strongest advocate, maybe not their strongest. I would be their an advocate, and I'd be happy to support reduction in wastage wherever it could be found. If there's wastage, let's root it out. I had a conversation with somebody last week around the topic of teachers. Last in, first out, and that sort of the tenure of teachers, etc. And he was very agitated about that topic, and this is something that's sort of a perennial issue, and in the end, I don't really support that view, because in a city like Manchester, we would simply fire all the experienced teachers, and when we're finished with that, we'd fire anybody who opened their mouth and said anything. And if you had 40 kids in your class and you told anybody, you get fired for that too. So I don't think that would be a good idea. On the other hand, though, I have to say that it seems to me that if you've got a teacher who is not performing well, and where their principal or whoever their immediate manager is can see that, where the school district administration can see that, and the superintendent's aware of that, and the union comes in to represent somebody if there's some grievance or something, and they recognize that. I don't know all the ins and outs of the process. I just know that it's not always easy to eliminate somebody let me put it this way: it isn't as easy as perhaps it should be to eliminate somebody who is not performing well. I think it's important that teachers are supported. I think if somebody has a challenge or a deficiency, like many businesses today, when you find an employee who's not able to And I did this when I was running companies where somebody was, their skill set was mismatched to the new demands of the job. And for a loyal employee or for any employee, the first thought was, can we repurpose this person? Is there a way, can we offer them an opportunity to make up the deficit before we'd ever remove them? We're not going to turn around to a 10-year veteran and say, hey, guess what? We're using a different machine. We've got a different process, or your Microsoft Office skills aren't up to the scratch where they were, or we need somebody with project or whatever. We would offer people, free tuition. We'd offer them support. We'd offer them whatever training they would need, and that was sort of the bargain that was had. And too many people today, I think, sort of look at private enterprise, and there's this false dichotomy, this false comparison, perhaps, between private enterprise and public enterprise. That somehow, in public enterprise, there's no rigor. And in private enterprise, well, if you don't do your job, you're out tomorrow. And it's actually not as simple as that at all, right? I mean, in private enterprise, absolutely. If you're not a valued employee, if you're not demonstrating value can be demonstrated in many ways, though, right? If you're not demonstrating value, of course, you're eliminated because you're not fulfilling your side of the bargain. But in most companies that I know, now this might not happen in some businesses, but any decent business, any viable business, when somebody presents with issues, and this is why people have human resources departments. It isn't just to, for some companies it might be to whip people along and keep them in shape, but, people run into difficulties in their lives. They go through a bad relationship. They have a sick family member. They have mental health challenges. They have physical challenges. Usually, what good companies do is they work with those employees, because they look and they say, we really like employee X. The bargain is that person's been here for a year, 6 months, 6 years, 60 years, and we'll do what we can to get them back to where they need to be. And of course, there's a short amount of patience with that. It's not as though private companies are going to waste tons of resources on it, but when people quote sort of the callousness of private enterprise, the fact is that if you were such a company, nowadays you go online when you apply for a job. You can go online. You can go to places like Glassdoor.com. And then there are many other sites where you can actually look at the reputation of the company and how previous employees feel about it. And if you're an empowered employee, that means if you're not a commodity, it's very hard if you are. I've nothing against landscapers. Some of my friends actually are landscapers, and if you're out there, hi guys. I'm just using you as an example, so I hope you won't be hurt. But if you're a kid who's decided to come out of school and you're working as a landscaper, and you don't have special skills, you're just the next landscaper down the path, then it's a little more difficult. But if you have a richer set of skills, then good employees are hard to find. And secondly, when those employees are looking for positions, guess what? They shop around, right? They go and look at other companies and say, which one? I've got 3 job offers. Which one will I go to? And they'll go to the company that's more compassionate or the company that's got the better reputation. And that better reputation isn't just about salary and benefits, but rather it's about those things. But it's also about the company, the business, and how it treats its workers. And then let's going back to Manchester. So in Manchester, I do think that there's room for discussion around how that happens in Manchester. I do know that it's been difficult in the case of Manchester, where we've been pink slipping people, where there's this, and hopefully we can bring this to an end, where there's this constant threat of sort of the tide goes out every June or February, March, April, and May. The tide goes out, and we never know how far out the tide is coming and whether it'll come back in or not. So we don't know if you don't know if your boat's going to remain afloat. And I know for certain, I've got friends who have abandoned the Manchester School District despite a strong level of commitment to their community and still living in this community, the kind of people we want and need in this community. I know some of them who have packed their bags and gone off to work in surrounding towns because of the issue of the insecurity of employment in the city of Manchester. Um, and that insecurity occurs in many ways. In one way, it is simply losing one's job is the most dire, of course. And I go back to 5 or 6 years ago when we eliminated 164 positions in Manchester. That was I don't know if you'd call it life changing for me, but I didn't have a teacher in my family. I didn't have actually a neighbour of mine who was a teacher. But when we eliminated 164 teachers, the catastrophe that was. If there weren't 164 empty houses or apartments in Manchester with U-Haul vans putting furniture in them, taking people away, there was still a very high number. And there were lots of tears, and there was a real break, and it was not a small thing. And those who like to believe, well, we had to do it, and we were doing the right thing, nonsense. There's sort of this lack of understanding and compassion is that act had a long-term effect on the City of Manchester School District, and then to continue to do it in the following years has had an effect on the City of Manchester. It's had an effect on the morale of teachers and of administrators, and I'm hoping that the small step forward that we're taking right now, even though we're having a net backward movement in that we're going to have 14 less teachers than we had last year, but at least people can say, well, they're trying to put some programs back and we're starting to see some right things. And as I said to Dr. Vargas at the end of this last process, he didn't need me to tell him. He's a big boy. But it's important that a couple of things need to happen for this for the taxpayers, for the aldermen, and for the school board. Is it needs to be clear in this year that rather than be self-congratulatory, that it's very important that Dr. Vargas deliver what he said he would and take the money given and put it in the programs where we're going to see the addition of foreign languages in middle schools, etc. But as part of that, every time that we talk about that, we must also say that we did this despite the net loss, and that this is a good faith step on behalf of the administration and Dr. Vargas and the school board for the Board of Mayor and Aldermen, because what they really need to do now is change the dynamic when they go back next year. And the first alderman or taxpayer who next year says, oh, we gave you $2 million last year extra, you should immediately be firing back at them twofold and saying, first of all, you didn't give us $2 million extra. You gave us $3 million less than we needed to keep the programs and teachers that we had, and we had to eliminate people and programs. But yes, we did commit to you that if you gave us the $2 million, we would spend it and we would affect kids in classrooms, and it would actually lower class sizes, it would reintroduce programs that were lost, etc. So therefore, we're coming back to you. This was my conversation with Dr. Vargas. We're coming back right at you in 2018 and saying, the previous argument, which was, you're going to keep just throwing money at this problem, and you give them money and they're just going to waste it anyway, you'll be able to say, no, we didn't waste it. You gave us the money and we put it into effect. And this year, this is what we want. And we want it for good reasons. We want it because these are things that were removed previously. These are things that our children deserve. These are things that a normal school district would have. And I'm hoping that will be fruitful next year. That when teachers and students and parents look at the now, to use an expansion might be too strong a word, but now seeing that there are some additions, say at the middle school level, and that there'll be some alleviation of overcrowding at the grade schools, that perhaps people will look at the Manchester School District differently, and we'll have a movement to positivity and away from the negative view, which is what we've had now for too long. I think we should be taking much larger steps to demonstrate that we have a commitment in Manchester to our schools, because the day that we actually the day when the narrative is that the City of Manchester has turned a corner and values education, and some of the best schools in the state are in the City of Manchester, that day, ladies and gentlemen, your property and mine are going to go up in value. You and I will be wealthier people the day after that happens than we were before. And that brings me nicely to a point that happened this week where I felt the great sucking sound when it comes to property values this week. Let me just say the calling number is 640-3091, and you're very welcome to join the conversation, or it would be a conversation if you joined. How about that? But I heard a big sucking sound in my property values this week when the transcript of the phone call from President Trump was released, and he called New Hampshire a drug-infested den. That's the kind of hit that it takes quite a bit of time to overcome, and I don't doubt whatsoever that comment in and of itself will have a direct effect on Manchester's ability and the state's ability to continue to attract families, etc., to the state. So I think it's easy to sort of beat up on it and say that it was a bad thing, it was a stupid thing to say. I think it was inaccurate, but obviously it's a challenge that we need to overcome. It would have been nice if during the same conversation President Trump could have added something about education and say that the state of New Hampshire is a drug-infested den, and Manchester schools are whatever derogatory term he would like to use for them, and then maybe we'd have people all fired up and wanting to do something about that. I think there's an opportunity for Manchester. I saw one person, a candidate from one of the Jimmy LaHoo, who's running against Erica Connors for school board, made the comment that perhaps one of the good things that might happen from this is that people would recognise that the drug epidemic wasn't just a Manchester problem. I think they already knew that. I think that anybody who lives in New Hampshire, I don't think there's a family that hasn't been affected. I have family in Bedford, and so my wife comes from there, and we still have some family in Bedford, and I don't think there's a family in Bedford that's not affected by the opiate crisis. Some of them catastrophically, and some of them not so much. So with all due respects, I don't believe that this was helpful at all. I think it was already the case that most people looking at the opiate crisis knew that it wasn't just a Manchester problem. But it is a place that real action needs to be taken, and hopefully at last some action. So I know that President Trump was actually meeting with people today. He was having a meeting on this topic during his vacation. And I don't know what will come of that, because that meeting was on just about as this program was starting. But some real action needs to be taken, and that will benefit Manchester as much as the rest of the state. But the issue for Manchester, we have two things, as I see it, that are like weights around our neck when it comes to people having faith in and being happy to live and wanting to come to our city. And the two weights we have around our neck are, one is the image or the interpretation or what people see as the opioid crisis, and secondly, it is our schools. And we need, there's a slate of candidates running for school board and aldermen, that people will be knocking on doors and sending out literature over the next few months. And that group of people at the end need to grapple with this problem of how do we change the mindset, how do we change the opinion of parents in Manchester about schools. I was very disappointed, and if they recognise who they are, I don't mean I was disappointed in them per se, but one family that I know and like, and I was talking to parents last week, and they have somebody who, their oldest kid is about to enter high school and is going to the public school systems because they've come through the public school system. And one of the parents is a teacher, not doesn't work as a teacher, but has a teaching qualification. So their eldest is going into high school in Manchester, and then they have two other children, and the other child, who's halfway through grade school, is being pulled out to go into a charter school. And I talked to this lady, and I said, so what was the rationale for the decision? And there's always multiple things, right? Had to do with the individual kid, etc. But ultimately, she's a teacher, and she said, having her kid, and her kid goes to, it's either Webster or Smith Road. Um, Her child was in a class of 30 kids in second or third grade, and she's saying, I'm not gambling my child's future on a city that thinks that 30 kids in a grade school class is okay. And when they're doing when they're in doing math in that class, we're in any subject we're way beyond what the state, or at what the state says is the absolute limit. This lady, as somebody who's qualified in that area, says is we're at the limit of what the state says is dysfunctional. These are not guidelines. These are not, as people try to claim them to be, oh, we're at the standard. No, we're not at the standard. I wish the state had a standard. I wish the state would come up with a standard, and if Mr. Edelblut would do that, I'd give him a kiss on each cheek as though he were arriving in the airport in Paris. I wish he would come up with what is the standard? What would be the ideal standard for grade school classes in the state of New Hampshire? And the idea, whatever the ideal is, I don't know what the ideal is, but most people would say once you get on beyond the early 20s, 21, 22, that you're out over the top of the numbers that are reasonable, and that kids start to not get the education, the teaching, the mentoring, the support that they need when you get to those numbers. But anyway, what we have state maximums, which in and of themselves are unenforceable. But what was troubling to me was, here's this beautiful family that I know, nice people, and here they are deciding to take their next two children out and take them out of the public school system. And I found that very disheartening, because it's one thing for a family living in Manchester with newborns or 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds, and they're trying to decide based on asking people, visiting schools, talking, where should I go, what should I do? And you could say that they're sort of uninformed buyers, and it's more perception than reality. Here we have a family who have just put a kid through, a grade school, a middle school, and is going on to starting high school in Manchester, who had a reasonable education 8-9 years ago when she started out. But now we've gotten to the case where we have 30 kids in the other kids' classroom, and the parents just don't want to do it anymore. And this is my fundamental disagreement with Mayor Gatsis, and why I have continued to oppose him, because as somebody pointed out here, and rightfully 2 weeks ago, it isn't just Mayor Gatsis, and I fully agree with that. And I'm not, maybe I am fixated on that. I'm not trying to be fixated on that, but in the end, the buck stops somewhere. The chief executive for the city is Mayor Gatsis, and in this case, he's the guy insisting that it's all okay, and he's the guy that has resisted change for at least the 8 years that he's been in office, and for the years before. He has his hands all over the teacher contract from that he was part of developing, or he developed before he even became mayor. So he fully owns the entire scenario, and then to insist that everything's fine, and he just, he's stubborn in that regard. He doesn't want to do anything about it, and so therefore we're left. We're left with these situations where we're losing, in this case, this beautiful family, nice kids, very capable, and we're losing them out of our school system because we simply are not supplying the product that people want. I talked to somebody today who was talking about West High School, and they said that West High School can and should be turned around. Well, first of all, when you say it has to be turned around, it means you imply that there's something wrong there. But I don't want to play games. I think there is. I've said before, I love Mr. Dishard. He's a great guy. I think a very capable person, who's now been over there for more than a year. But the people of Hooksett, as an example, have the opportunity to send their kids to West High, and they simply refuse to send them. And in the case of Central, there are still kids coming from, as there will be again this year, coming out of Hooksett into Central, albeit as a much smaller number. But people go where you can't force people, right? They vote with their feet. So I would love to see something done at West High School so we could turn around the both the reality and the image of that school. But as it is today, with the small population that it has, and unable to fields or Division One teams or sometimes any teams at all in some sports, it's just so disappointing in the city of Manchester to have that happening, and then having the other schools sit in sort of without being without any vigor, without any support, without any plan to bring them to their to their best. I just one thing from last week. I was somebody pointed out to me that in my conversation last week, I misspoke when I said that the last time we built a school in Manchester was 1992. It actually, McLaughlin was built in the 1997-1998 school year. So I believe the first class started there in 1998. So again, perfect I am not. But it's never. I try not to bend. I do not bend facts to meet my views, or certainly I don't do it consciously. And I'm happy to hear from people like that gentleman who pointed out that I was off in my facts about the most recent school. Because in the end, what we're all trying to do, if you're listening to this show, I think you're listening because you're hoping to get the insight might be a conceit on my behalf, but to get some information, and because you probably may not spend as much time looking at the school district and following what's going on and the blow by blow as I do, that perhaps you learn something from it. But yeah, so once again, I did make that mistake last week, but I think as a city, we have an opportunity to change the view of the city of Manchester. And my biggest hope, and somebody called in last week and asked me about, Joyce Craig and why I supported Joyce Craig and her policies, etc. And as it turns out, as I was speaking, somebody else called, and I wasn't able to finish the thought. But my main reason for supporting Joyce Craig is because she is not trying to pretend that everything's fine in the city of Manchester, and she recognises that public education is one of the key legs of the stool on which we're going to rely to move forward. We saw my friend my friend Kevin Kavanagh win that wonderful special election and the Hooksett Wars 1, 2 and 12 area, District 16, a few weeks back. And Kevin was very plain in his outspokenness, and one of the couple of things that he led on was the need to have good schools and good schooling opportunities for the children of the city of Manchester, and that's a very important thing. It's important to the economic and social well-being of the city, and it needs to be turned around. It needs to be turned around both in actuality, in hard facts on the ground, but the narrative has to change too. And that narrative isn't going to be changed by hiring somebody to do publicity, because if they're doing the publicity right, they would have to publicize everything across the board and not just the individual good things, which we see happen every day, but also the other things. The mayor was at pains, it's now a couple of months ago, to point out that the great things that were happening in our schools. He talked about the valedictorians at Memorial and Central High School, and what great examples they were, and how their speeches should be read by others to see their abilities and etc. And what wonderful example of education in Manchester they were. And of course, when the mayor was talking about at that point about the wonderful things that are happening in our schools, he very carefully didn't mention the fact that some of the things that were happening in our schools was that there had been a rape at West High School 2 years ago, and that hadn't been mentioned for the period. But I expect more to come of that as time goes on here, because we've got litigation going on and people are being sued and all the rest of it, and it's just anyway. I've tried to stay away from it because it's just too troubling to me that anybody would play politics with such an issue, and so I find that just a difficult territory to visit. So back to this thing of the valedictorians, what the great things happening in our schools. But again, what Mayor Gatsas didn't tell people was that the valedictorian at Central High School and the valedictorian at Memorial both were products not just of the Manchester Public Schools, but they also were products, in one case, of Catholic schools in their early education. The young man at Memorial went to Catholic school for grade school, and the valedictorian at Central High School went to grade school in Hooksett and then to Cawley Middle School in Hooksett and then came into Central High School. I happen to know both of those young men. It's one of the graduating. I have a child in that graduating class, and both of those young men are friends of our family, and I'm very proud of both of them as valedictorians. But it seemed to me particularly silly for the mayor to stand up and hold these guys, who are great guys, as examples of what the Manchester School District could do. I wonder how many kids, those kids are going to Harvard and Dartmouth, for instance. I wonder how many more kids in Manchester might have gone into an Ivy League school if they hadn't been in classes of 30 and at one point 42 in our over the term of Mayor Gatsas's being mayor. There's been a real effect to that. We just can't measure it. There's a huge effect to property prices in the city of Manchester, because people with families. Now, luckily, we have people coming in here, sort of, double income, no kids people. But we have single people coming in, and so there's room for growth, for loft space and other things like that. But families, young families, are not coming to live in Manchester, and it's. I know that my house, and therefore your house, is worth less than what it could be or should be, because of the policies of Mayor Gatsas and of the current board of mayor and aldermen, and even the school board. For years, they've overseen this lack of investment, this lack of enthusiasm, this lack of leadership, this lack of foresight, this lack of vision, lack of excitement. It's amazing that, in the richest, one of the richest states in the union, and the economy, the stock market's at an all-time high. Companies have more money on hand than they've ever had historically. Unemployment at an all-time low. These are glory years, and yet the small-minded, penny-pinching individuals in Manchester public life, led by Mayor Gatsas, and then a bunch of people behind whom who don't have the temerity to stand up and fight. In spite of the fact that all of this is going on, we still don't have a plan to move the school district forward 1 inch. We don't have any plan for what's coming next. Our people deserve more. The city deserves more. And I'm hopeful that from the slate of candidates that we have running, and with the people running for mayor, that we will have a new day in Manchester in the next 3 or 4 months, and that we'll head into 2018 with our heads held high, saying, okay, we're ready to take on the world, we're ready to do good things. We can't do it all at once. We can't get everything done in 1 year or even 3 or 4 years. But we have a plan and a vision, and we have leadership, and I'm confident that that's going to be the case. I'm hoping it is. I look forward, ladies and gentlemen, to talking to you all again next week. Thank you for spending time with me tonight. We have a school board meeting next week, so we should have some actionable items to be talking about next Tuesday night. Have a great week. Enjoy the summer as it continues, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.